You got the cutting edge weapons, but your scam's still the same as it's been since the Romans. Yo, it's the Patriot game. Yo, that's the war racket. It's the war racket. It's the
So
war
much
racket.
for tuning back in with us. It is at 9:31, and I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. This is Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. We do invite listeners to call in at 707-923-3911 or email your questions at heroesandpatriots@gmail.com. We're beginning our next half hour, John, and we have another first-time guest with us, and that is Chuck Collins. Mr. Collins is director of the program on Inequality and the Common Good at the Institute for Policy Studies. He has co-authored the report Gilded Giving 2020, How Wealth Inequality Distorts Philanthropy and Imperils Democracy. Also, The Giving Pledge at 10, a case study in top-heavy philanthropy. Chuck Collins, welcome to Heroes and Patriots.
Hey, thanks for having me, John and Mary.
You bet. You have been said that you have actually said that private philanthropy has always been a form of power for wealthy donors, but as wealth inequality has exploded in recent decades, it has concentrated that private power in fewer hands and all subsidized by private taxpayers. Talk about that real briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hear about billionaires giving away their money. We hear about things like the Giving Pledge, which is Warren Buffett and Bill Gates 10 years ago organized to get other billionaires to give their wealth away. And I think we're supposed to feel a sort of warm glow about this and feel positive that this is these are acts of generosity, which some of them are. But we should be skeptical about this because these are the same individuals that dominate our political system, that dominate our economy, and their philanthropy is becoming an extension of their private power and influence. So that's a concern for democracy, the independence of the nonprofit sector, and also the ways in which they use the tax code. Those are all concerns that we should have as we look at and hear about billionaire philanthropy.
As you know, in the last week we had the CEOs of Facebook, Google,
Tim Cook.
Apple, and who was it? Apple, Google, Amazon. But here before Congress, trying to defend themselves against an impulse to rein in some of their power and wealth and some of their monopoly practices with new antitrust legislation. And to a person, they came across as arrogant. They came across as evasive. They came across as uninformed, which of course they are not. We're talking about white alpha males who are obsessive compulsive in the extreme and control freaks. What did you think of that hearing, and what do you think that bodes for philanthropy? Because these guys have also pledged to give a lot of their money away.
Well, I think it's good that there was that kind of scrutiny. And what's striking to me is how those wealthy individuals, Zuckerberg in particular, use their philanthropy as kind of a distraction and a deflection. And we saw this with the Sackler family, the folks who owned Purdue Pharma and made billions of dollars off of the opioid epidemic, but also spread their money around to museums and art institutions. And I think that kind of neutralizes the kind of critical perspective we should have and also government oversight. So we one of the things we at Institute for Policy Studies, we've been tracking how billionaires are doing during this pandemic, and their wealth is surging. As of today, the U.S. billionaire class has seen their wealth go up over $700 billion since the beginning of the pandemic, March 18th, when lockdown started. So, and among those were the big four tech barons that appeared before Congress. Their wealth is surging while others are dying or facing debilitating illness or job loss.
That's exactly right. You have a company like Amazon that's just cleaning up during this pandemic as small and medium-sized businesses go bankrupt because they can't conduct business and commerce as usual. And online merchants are just cleaning up, led, of course, by Amazon. Again, I can't think of a CEO that is more white, more alpha, more obsessive compulsive, more controlling than Jeff Bezos. If that's the future of philanthropy, I think we're in trouble.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, Bezos is an interesting archetype. His wealth has gone up 62% since the beginning of the pandemic. He's now worth $184 billion. Interesting contrast, his ex-wife, Mackenzie, now Scott Bezos, made her first move in philanthropy. She took the giving pledge, pledging to give away all of her wealth during her lifetime. Jeff Bezos has not taken that pledge. And she stepped up and actually gave all this money directly to racial justice groups. She talked about how she's returning the money to the community. She pulled in advisors from Black, Indigenous, people of color groups to help her think through her first foray into giving. She didn't create, her own foundation in her own iconic image to hold money in perpetuity. She moved the money directly, $1.7 billion to charity. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition with her ex there, and a little bit of an example of like, okay, we should be suspicious about the perils of billionaire philanthropy, but there's also some possibilities that if some of these folks figured out how to smartly share their money and involve a lot of other people, that could do some good.
Would you care to comment on the phenomenon of those companies that have gone bankrupt, and yet the top CEOs and officers are receiving enormous payouts? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is not surprising. This has been sort of the business model for top managers, CEOs. It's the heads I win, tails you lose, kind of model of running a company, as opposed to we're all in it together. So that has been the model. People are, these are managers who are trying to extract and take as much money out of a company as possible in the short term that they're there. So under the pandemic, it's not surprising to see that behavior continue. And these are companies that are receiving significant government help, government subsidies, bailouts. So all the more reason why we as the community public sector should be saying, look, we shouldn't be subsidizing these take the money and run CEOs. Right.
How would if you were acting as a private consultant to some of these mega billionaires and possibly their family foundations, how would you advise them on more equitable giving strategies, particularly strategies that would further peace and social justice, which seems like the two most basic things we should be fighting for?
Well, first, I think with the companies, I would encourage them. I would advise them to share the wealth with their employees. Prior to the pandemic, at Davos, which is sort of the sort of global billionaire Woodstock, that's convened in at some little mountain village in Switzerland, or they all get together. They're all talking about stakeholder capitalism. What does that mean? It means you're recognizing that capital investors aren't the engines of the economy. It's the workers and the communities and the taxpayers and the consumers that also contribute to that wealth. Well, here you have 100 companies that the Financial Times say are prospering, profiteering really during this pandemic. If Jeff Bezos wanted to change his image, why wouldn't he give 20% of his stock overnight to his employees? Do what the Chobani Yogurt CEO did. He said, look, my workers are creating this wealth and they should be owners. and transferred, over time, 20% of the company's ownership. So that's one thing, is just changing the ownership, sharing the wealth through the ownership of the company. But then I would be advising these folks not to create private family foundations that are going to be around for hundreds of years, but to create democratic institutions, support not just a group of wealthy family members sitting around deciding how to spend their billions, but transfer money to democratically controlled community organizations, community foundations. Let other people allocate this money, not just the billionaires.
I think who's the head of the Ford Foundation? What's his
Daren
name?
Walker.
Daren Walker. I'm a big fan of his. He and his board takes a lot of credit. Do direct infusions of money. Have direct impact, like in the city of Detroit, when the city of Detroit was going bankrupt, even to the extent where the city was thinking about selling the museum's art collections. I mean, how desperate does a city have to be to deaccession their museum collections?
Right.
He wrote them a check. He wrote the city a check. This is a city that is predominantly black, poor, got a lot of problems, and he took the direct route to help them out. You don't see many foundation executives like him. Why not? And how can we recruit and support more foundations like the one at Ford?
Well, Daren Walker does have that experience of having grown up in poverty and not having a lot of privilege. When you talk about Detroit, you're talking about my hometown. I think there are great examples where, private foundations could move money, sort of out of the domain of the wealthy and to communities and projects that don't get access to traditional money. So, and one thing that Ford has done and a number of foundations are doing is that they are increasing their payout right now. So private foundations are only mandated to give away 5% of their assets, which means that in the last few decades, a lot of foundations have seen their assets, their wealth grow dramatically. And, this is not the moment to be warehousing wealth. The nonprofit sector is in big trouble. 10% of the workforce, we know that over the coming months, state and local budgets are going to get trimmed, and that's going to be cuts to nonprofits. It's really time for the charity sector to step up and pay out more. And if they haven't figured that out, we are proposing a law called an emergency charity stimulus, which is to get these foundations to double their payout to 10% over the next 3 years. And we're working to actually get that to be passed as part of some of these stimulus bills and recovery bills that are coming down the pike.
And Chuck, isn't it also true that Daren Walker at the Ford Foundation just did a remarkable thing, very ambitious thing, very creative thing, in not just increasing his payouts, but also going to the bond market. He is borrowing against the future earnings of the Ford endowment and using those revenues that he's raising in the municipal, what's a tax-exempt bond offering, to fund immediate funding priorities right now. Do you care to comment on this huge and important and very, very creative and ambitious initiative by Ford Foundation?
Yeah, I would just echo. I think it's their desire is to pay out more. They don't want to cut into their endowment, and so they are leveraging their ability to borrow and float a bond and pay over time to give out more money now. It's not a strategy that's available to a lot of foundations. They're just not that big. It does increase the payout, which is in some ways, I think the key thing right now is to move more money to the front lines if possible. I would say overall it was done partly to avoid government coming in and mandating the payout increase. So I would argue we still need to do that. That it's great that Ford and others are voluntarily doing it, but it's not a substitute. It's also a little bit of a Wall Street strategy. So a lot of these private foundations, family foundations, have kind of Wall Street people sitting at the table, and God forbid the last thing that they would ever allow happen is that the assets of these foundations would diminish. And so they have that whole kind of capital preservation, the more you got, the better kind of mentality. Whereas I think we really actually should be encouraging foundations to give while they're alive, give their money sooner rather than later. There's a guy named Chuck Feeney who started the duty-free shops. He gave away $8 billion in 22 years. He did it in a really smart way. He's no longer a billionaire. He's living in a modest apartment in San Francisco. You don't have to amass and build a multi-generational foundation to do good. In fact, maybe we're better off if you do more in one generation than spreading it out over multiple generations.
Chuck, we have 2 phone calls waiting for you. It's 47 minutes past the hour. This is Heroes and Patriots. Go ahead, caller.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So I think your work is really important. And I was wondering if you could talk, in your latest reports, you've talked a lot, Chuck, about another tactic of donor-advised funds and the need for legislation. And along those lines, I wonder both if you could talk about the donor-advised funds and also whether is it time for another congressional investigation of foundations? There hasn't been a really intense one since 1968. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these points.
Boy, thanks for that question. You're absolutely right. The framework that foundations currently exist was established in 1969, which, if you think about it, was the time of greatest relative economic equality any time in the last century. The richest 1% only had less than 10% of all private wealth. Now they have almost over 40%. So the rules governing philanthropy need to be modernized. There need to be hearings. There needs to be kind of big thinking policy reforms. And the caller points out that there's another giving way people give, which is through donor advised funds. Again, these are wealthy donors who give through private foundations, and more affluent donors and wealthy donors giving through what's called a donor advised fund, which is it's an account, could be at a community foundation. More and more they are at large financial companies like Fidelity. And the problem with one of the design flaws of these donor advised funds is a donor puts their money in that fund, they get their tax break, but then there's no mandate that they move the money to a working charity or nonprofit. And more people kind of get into this mentality like, well, this is my donor advised fund, and maybe someday I'll pass it on to my kids, as opposed to this should be a revolving door and the money comes in and the money should move out fairly quickly. So as part of our emergency charity stimulus proposal, we believe that there should be a mandated payout for donor advised funds, but that should probably be the law going forward. So, as the caller suggests, we need to think about redoing the rules around philanthropy to mandate that the money move, that it flow, that it not be warehoused, that the wealthy aren't using philanthropy as kind of an extension of their personal power. The whole intent of the law, the charitable giving law, is that people get a tax break. They reduce their taxes when they relinquish control and dominion over their money. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow these wealthy folks have figured out how to get the tax deduction without really having to relinquish control. And we need to fix that.
Chuck, we have that caller back on the line who was disconnected. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead.
Thank you for an incredibly informative show. The first half, of course, makes you just want to jump into your morning cup of coffee and drown yourself, murdering hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians certainly was a war crime. Thank you for illuminating that. As Reagan said, we'll begin bombing in 5 minutes. Could you please comment very briefly? You've been talking eloquently about the wealthy and their elevated position. Could you address the fact that art is often used to shield wealth, park tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in art, and then move that art either overseas, sell it through a private sale? This is also very true in the narco world, as well as private corporations that the CIA owns in order that they can profit and foment more angst, war, and hatred in the world. Thank you again. Heroes and patriots. Let's have more of those.
Well, great point that your caller makes, which is art, and we're obviously talking about highly valued works of art are used by kleptocrats and used by wealthy people to park their money, and they're basically turned into commodities. It's also a lot of anonymous wealth, hidden wealth, is owned and parked in art, and there are now these free trade zone art depots. They're literally buildings that are considered international free trade zones where billions, if not trillions, of dollars worth of art are sitting in these little temperature-controlled buildings where they're traded and sold without having to pay taxes, without having to, literally touch down in a nation state. So it's just another way the wealthy game. The other thing is that a lot of these donor-advised funds that the previous caller talked about receive these complicated, appreciated assets, and it's one of the ways in which they kind of get enormous tax breaks by giving appreciated artwork. But the same thing is true of jewelry and land and other commodities. And it's just it's part of the game of how wealthy people move their money around the world and also store the value other than having it in the stock market.
Yeah, this last caller's question is very well informed. I used to do some work for the U.S. Treasury's FinCom, which is their financial crimes unit. And one of our theories on the robbery at the Isabella Stewart Duncan Museum was that Gardner Museum was that the art ended up in the hands of drug lords. Why? Not because they wanted the art, but because it was a unit of value that they could use for money laundering purposes. So, like, say if you have a Rembrandt that is appraised at $25 million, it's a lot easier to move a Rembrandt painting than it is to move $25 million in cash. Mm-hmm. And particularly with these new duty-free warehouses, by the way, which were featured on Showtime's series Billionaires. This is a thing now. This is like a $25 million denomination of currency. It's like $25 million Bitcoin or $25 million bill. It's an extremely efficient way to move money. It's a very well-informed question. I'd like to finish by asking, the need for philanthropy as what I believe we're moving into the next Great Depression. On an annualized basis, the U.S. economy, the GNP, contracted by more than a third, 36%. In the last quarter. That's on an annualized basis. We're facing record numbers of personal bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies, high unemployment. Unemployment benefits are running out. America's never been in more trouble, and our national debt is at $26 trillion. So the future of bailouts is questionable, and certainly we're facing a massive devaluation of the dollar, with gold now selling for more than $2,000 an ounce. The need for philanthropy, enlightened philanthropy, has never been greater. Just maybe we can end the show on that note.
Yeah, I think, the first thing, though, I would say is philanthropy is not a substitute for a fair tax system, and adequately funded public services. That said, there's $1.2 trillion sitting in private foundations, another $120 billion sitting in these donor-advised funds. This would be a great time. If people are waiting for the rainy day, as they say, the rain is here. And it's really not just the next year, it's probably the next several years that we really are going to need philanthropy to step up, move money out of the warehouses and to the front lines to really address the acute pain and suffering that a lot of our communities are going to be going through. So it's not a time to warehouse wealth, it's time for it to move. And there are good examples of people doing that, and we just need to lift up and encourage that, and in some cases mandate it a little bit more strongly.
Chuck, we had another caller, but I think we're out of time. And we would love for you to come back and update us on how things progress as we move through the political system, which we really didn't touch upon, specifically the power and wealth funding our GOP and so forth. But thank you for being with us. It was a delight to have you.
You're a wonderful guest. And again, Chuck Collins is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's the co-author of the report, Gilded Giving 2020, How Wealth Inequality Distorts Philanthropy and Imperils Democracy. You've been a great guest. Thank you, Chuck.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I love Humboldt County, and I love KMUD. Whenever I'm there, I always listen to it on the radio. Love the conversations you're having. So let's
right on.
Take care. And
just
I've got a
wanted
sister
to add
there in
that,
Arcata, so I'm happy to be on any time to say hello.
we had a caller who called a little too late to ask his question, but he was talking about philanthropy, that people can give to KMUD. And he was thanking all of you for a great show.
You got to become a member, Chuck.
Thank
all
you
the way
so
from
much.
Boston. I can listen online. Yeah.
Okay. Bye now.
Take care. Thanks all.